Hello and welcome. Today I want to talk about intestinal health and how improving or worsening intestinal health can affect cancer patient outcomes. Now, you've probably heard of the saying, "You are what you eat." And that saying is very true. After all of the cells that make up our body, all of the proteins, all of the minerals, all of the vitamins, all of the fatty acids, carbohydrates, anything else that's inside of our bodies, any compound, all of the hormones, they are produced from precursor material. Our body doesn't just magically create a hormone, it has to have some precursor, and that has to have some precursor. And in the end, all of these things that our bodies produce and use as building blocks have a origin outside of our body, and we consume them at some point as food. So in that sense, we are very much exactly what we eat. We are a reflection of that. However, everything we eat also passes through our intestines before being absorbed. It isn't simply that we eat something, it is absorbed into us and we become broccoli because we eat broccoli. It is of course processed, it is broken down, some parts are excreted that we don't eat, and all of the useful parts are absorbed into our bodies optimally. However, depending on how well the intestinal lining and how well the intestines are, how healthy are the intestines, depending on that answer, it is possible that even though we eat all of the right things, we provide our body with all of its building blocks, our intestines can't properly process them. And in that case, the intestinal health significantly impacts health and well-being. And of course, it might very well impact cancer, since that is simply a disease, and depending on how healthy the body is, of course, it might have a significant impact on our cancer patient outcomes. And this is exactly what we want to look at today. Now, my name is Cedric. I am one of the co-founders of Marchwood, and I've got a bachelor's degree in molecular biotechnology. At Marchwood, we help cancer patients such as maybe yourself or someone you know with outliving their diagnosis, and we aim to do this by informing people about the disease, about the biological background, about the cellular mechanics of cancer so that they can understand their disease better, and also by recommending dietary and lifestyle choices or changes that people can implement in their own life without requiring external medical advice so that they can, maximize their chances of surviving. Also, because we don't believe in creating a cult, we don't believe in indoctrinating you. I don't want you to just blindly believe anything I say. I don't want you to believe me if I say you should drink alcohol to survive cancer, or you should eat a bunch of fiber, or you should eliminate a bunch of fiber. I want you to be able to double check that information. I want you to be able to create your own opinion. And to that purpose, we are putting together a living project. We're in the process of writing a book at marchwood.com/mosaic. And this book, this living project that we keep updated all the time, it contains all of the methods that we suggest to people, all of the lifestyle changes that we suggest to a cancer patient. It includes the scientific rationale behind them, and it includes all of the scientific sources that we base that understanding of cancer on. So that you, whenever you see anything in our claims, you can go to the Mosaic Marchwood or marchwood.com/mosaic method, to that book, that living project, and you can find the scientific sources to that for any claims that we make, so that you can double check whether it actually makes sense and whether it's actually true. Because I don't want to indoctrinate you, I want to inform you, and in order to do that, I have to allow you to question me. And in fact, I want you to question me. If there's anything you don't understand, if there's anything you think doesn't make sense, feel free to leave a comment. This is exactly how we learn. We learn by being questioned, right? So with that out of the way, I think we can jump into the main part of the video. Of course, starting off with the purpose of the gut. What exactly is the gut lining, and how does it fulfill its purpose, right? So if you don't know too much about cellular anatomy and the anatomy of the human body, you might not actually know this, but the cells that make up the intestinal lining, that make up the gut barrier, are actually the same type of cells as the ones on your skin. And that means these are both epithelial cells. The main purpose of all epithelial cells, regardless of whether they're in your skin or in your intestine, is to separate the inside of your body, so the inside of your organism, from the outside world, from the outside environment. Now, I think the reason for that is very intuitive to understand. After all, our bodies are very complex systems. They require fine-tuning of chemical environments, chemical solutions. Our blood is, for example, very tightly regulated in its pH, in its mineral content. And the same, of course, also goes for the surrounding of any of the other cells in your body. And as such, we can't just have them completely exposed to the outside world, right? Without any control, that would significantly alter the immediate environment in which our cells find themselves, which means that they would no longer survive. And this is where the epithelial cells come in. So on your hands, for example, they ensure that anything that you touch doesn't directly affect the muscle cells underneath and doesn't just go straight into the circulatory system, into the blood. However, with the intestinal lining, it might be a bit more confusing, because I just said that they're basically the epithelial cells, and thus also the cells of the gut lining, are supposed to separate you or separate your insides from your outsides. But the gut quite literally is inside of you. So how exactly do they separate us from an environment? And to understand that, we can try to visualize humans as a huge donut. So if we take a side profile of a donut, this is just kind of a cut through a donut, right? It still can connect around here, and then of course can connect around here. So you kind of have the donut hole in the middle. Now, if we take this and kind of elongate it upwards, we can end up at something like this. And it is here that you might already kind of be starting to understand where I'm going with this. Because if we take this and then allow the inside of the donut hole to become a bit more, a bit more finely or a bit more chaotic, so to speak, we can end up with something along the lines of this. So we still have the connection around, and then we have the donut hole on the other side, like this. And now if you put a head on top of this with a mouth that leads into here, and you put two arms and two legs on this, all of a sudden I think you can see how we went from our donut in the beginning all the way to, well, a human with his intestines. But this of course also means, because there's no cellular barrier, of course we have the ability as humans to kind of close off our throat, but still, as every time we swallow food, something from the outside world passes through our mouth, down our intestines, and that of course also carries, well, pathogens, proteins, contents from the outside world into our innards. And this is why the intestines are made out of epithelials, and this is also why they're exposed to the environment, because even though they are residing within our body, like place-wise, right, they are inside our body, the environment they're exposed to is actually a part of the outside environment that is foreign to our body. And this is also why we have the gut microbiome. It is literally an environment, a biome of bacteria that live inside of the gut. So now that we understand what exactly epithelial cells are, why our gut lining is actually exposed to the outside world, we can look at another purpose that is very specific to our gut lining cells compared to other epithelial cells. And that purpose is to facilitate the selective absorption or the selective permittance of nutrients into our body. Because if we kind of zoom into our intestines, onto the intestinal lining, and we look at what actually occurs on a cellular level, we see that we have these blocks of cells here. So this is just, each of these is a cell with a nucleus. And we can see that on one side we have the intestinal lumen, and on the other side we have the inside of your body. Now, in between the intestinal cells, so in between each of these cells, there is a gap, but in order to kind of tighten up that gap, there is something called tight junctions. So these are simply protein bridges, so to speak, that link one cell to the next and kind of act like the mortar between bricks when you build a house. If the mortar wasn't there and you tried to pour water into a pool that was built out of bricks, it would simply seep through the small little gaps and kind of still escape. However, if you put mortar there, you kind of seal up those gaps and the water remains contained. And this is exactly what we want here. We want all of the parts of the lumen to kind of just not be able to get into the body. However, of course, if this was all that happened, your body also wouldn't be able to take up nutrients. I mean, this is what we see in the unspecialized, in quotation marks, cells on your skin. The epithelial cells of your skin, you can put broccoli, you can put a slab of meat on it. It won't be digested and won't be absorbed because the epithelial cells on your skin aren't specialized for that. And the way the epithelial cells in your gut lining facilitate this uptake, the absorption of nutrients, is by producing and expressing channels or transporters that sit in their membrane and selectively allow the passage of select nutrients. So, for example, vitamins or protein fragments or amino acids or fatty acids. So this, by kind of expressing certain transporters and certain channels, the epithelial cells in the gut lining are able to selectively absorb the nutrients that they want, but using the tight junctions, they are still able to keep out everything that shouldn't enter your body. However, of course, if intestinal health decrease, this selective passage, this discrimination between all of the good stuff, all of the nutrients, and all of the pathogens, all of the bacteria and stuff that shouldn't enter your body breaks down, which of course can have severe side effects. But what exactly causes a reduction in intestinal health? How does intestinal health reduce, right? What are we actually looking at on a cellular level? Because it's very easy to say intestinal health decreased, but we don't actually understand what that means. And in most cases, what it refers to is actually the breakdown of the tight junctions. So, for example, inflammation or some dietary compounds can cause this, which means that if you have your cells, we now get the exactly described earlier scenario where you have a pool that needs to contain water built out of brick, but there's no water. So these intestinal tight junctions begin to break down. And all of a sudden, you might have bacteria on the outside, drawing a little bacterium. You might have some kind of undigested protein or anything else that will simply be able to slip through the gaps and infiltrate your body. Now, the reasons for why these barriers break down are various. Among them are, for example, intestinal inflammation, where, for example, if you have an infection inside of the gut lining cells, of course, there's not only going to be one cell, so there are going to be cells behind this, and this then transitions into your body itself. So at some point there will be blood vessels running here along that can absorb the nutrients. And if there's an infection anywhere inside of this kind of range of your intestinal cells, then that can cause altered gene expression. It can cause inflammatory reactions, which then lead to the breakdown of these tight junctions, which then means that more cells will enter your body, or more foreign, pathogens and bacteria and antigens will enter your body, which then again leads to more inflammation, which then can kind of cause a feedback cycle. However, just remove all of this over here. Second. There we go. Beside this, there's also dietary components that can cause this breakdown of the gut barrier. One of the most wide known, and the one that even though you might not know how it does it, you might know that it's bad for some people for intestinal health, is gluten. This is a compound found in wheat, and of course, it's one of the most common causes for intestinal discomfort. It's also one of the most widely accepted ones. A lot of people know that if you have gluten intolerance, you have to abstain from gluten in order to rejuvenate your intestines and your gut. And the way it does that is by actually binding to receptors on the cell surface. So these intestinal cells, what's it called? They express receptors that gluten can bind to, and these receptors then inside of the cell affect various different transcription ways and change gene expression in a way that leads to the secretion of something called zonulin, which then in the end causes the breakdown of these tight junctions. And this is why when gluten intolerant people eat gluten, they get such severe reactions. They get diarrhea, they get abdominal pain, they get bloating, because all of a sudden the usually tightly controlled separation between the gut lumen and their own body fails. Bacteria invade their own body en masse. All of a sudden there's inflammation, there's exchange of fluids from inside the body and outside the body. The body doesn't properly regulate the moisture content of the stool, of like what's actually passing through the gut, and they get severe reactions. Now, I think where most people go wrong with this is that they believe that gluten only affects gluten intolerant people, but that's actually wrong. Gluten affects everyone. So even though I'm not severely gluten intolerant, I don't start shitting like a rocket, to put it in very blunt words. The gluten still affects these so-called CXCR3 receptors, and it still causes altered gene expression inside of my gut, and it still causes the breakdown of tight functions. The only thing that changes is how severe this is. And of course, gluten isn't the only one. There are also compounds in, for example, tomatoes, aubergines, nightshades in general. There are lectins who have much the same, much the same mechanism of disrupting tight junctions. There are also legumes and some nuts and cereals in general contain perhaps not gluten, but even, for example, something as like rye or oats or maybe even maize have been shown to contain proteins that exhibit these characteristics. So a lot of these dietary components in our food, also alcohol, by the way, can lead to the breakdown of tight junctions and thus to the breakdown of intestinal function. Interestingly, another thing, one that doesn't necessarily affect the tight junctions, so in that scenario the tight junctions might still be perfectly well, is bacterial overgrowth. So if you all of a sudden get way too many of certain types of bacteria on the outside here, way more than you maybe should have, these will, just by their sheer amount of presence, will start migrating through the cells actually into the bloodstream and thus infiltrate your body and kind of spread throughout your body. Now, sometimes bacterial overgrowth is also supported by certain foods, for example, lectins, which are a compound often found in legumes, actually facilitate the growth of certain bacteria by enabling them to attach to the gut lining, which is a bit of a complicated process, but the foods that we eat also kind of alter the bacterial overgrowth and bacterial growth, composition, and the amount of bacteria, and can thus also support this overgrowth and invasion of our bodies by the bacteria. Now, on a bit of a tangent, what you might now be thinking of when I talk about our food influencing our bacterial composition, you might be thinking, aha, this is all going towards the microbiome. However, you might have often heard about a healthy or unhealthy microbiome and foods causing healthy or unhealthy microbiomes. There's a little problem with that whole claim, stemming from the fact that our food will affect our health and our microbiome at the same time. So if we look at the causal chain, you can look at the food that you eat. So you have the food, which affects the microbiome. And then the microbiome is postulated to affect our health. And given what we just looked at with microbial overgrowth being able to cause decreasing intestinal health and thus invasion of our bodies, I think this link here isn't actually very outlandish to suggest. However, the problem with the claims that you often hear about foods being good for a good, healthy microbiome is that foods also directly affect health. And these two effects are very difficult to properly separate. For example, if you have someone eating at McDonald's every day versus someone on a balanced Mediterranean diet with fish, with some meat, with some cereal, with some whole grains, with some vegetables, they will have very different microbiomes, most likely, and they will both be very different in regard to their health. However, would you really claim that the differences in their health of a person who eats a Mediterranean diet to one who eats McDonald's every day for each meal are purely due to the microbiome? Or would you say that clearly the food affecting the health directly is the major factor? That is the question. And even the best research, even though researchers may try as they want to separate these two effects, it is really impossible. So the common claim that a certain microbiome is good or a different microbiome is bad has very little mechanistic evidence for it. But that's a bit of a tangent. Getting back to the intestinal health, I now want to look at, since we looked at how do we actually get decreased intestinal health, I want to look at how this decreased intestinal health affects our bodies. Like, what are the consequences directly for parts other than directly ours, our intestines, for our bodies as a whole? Now, the first point I've already talked about, and that is bacterial invasion. Because, as I said, when these tight junctions break down, bacteria are able to squeeze through the gaps much more easily and invade your body. They enter your bloodstream, they get transported all around, and of course your body reacts to that. All of a sudden there's a bacterial infection from your gut into your body, and you will start getting sick. Now, the severity of that, of course, depends on how significant the breakdown of the gut barrier is, but the more severe it is, the more severe these consequences will be. And this is, for example, also why people, when they are gluten intolerant and they eat gluten, will be very lethargic on the next day, or they will be, besides just the purely intestinal effects, they will also have like systematic depressions. They will feel sick. They won't be energetic because their body is effectively fighting off an illness that was introduced by the gluten breaking down the intestinal barrier and then the bacteria migrating across. So that's, for example, one method or one of the consequences. Now, other than that, there's also intestinal autoimmune diseases following these bacterial invasions. This isn't always the case, but oftentimes things like inflammatory bowel disease or irritable bowel syndrome or inflammatory bowel disease actually succeed bacterial invasions because the bacteria invading express similar, surface proteins to some of the self-antigens. So to kind of explain this, we have to look at, just dive into a bit how the immune system actually works. And it works kind of by looking at a cell, and these cells present certain antigens, certain parts of the protein. And if they are infected by, for example, a virus, then parts of these viral proteins will be broken down, processed, and kind of shown to the outside world. Now, your body is smart enough that when an immune cell comes along, so the immune system, and kind of takes a look at these antigens that are presented, they can actually realize, hold up, this is not my own antigen, there is something wrong. This comes from an outside bacterium, it comes from an outside virus, there's something foreign about this that shouldn't be here. We need to eliminate whatever this is, and in the case of an infected cell, the cell gets killed, right? The problem is when bacteria invade you as an organism, when they travel across the gut barrier and if they are bacteria that have similar antigens, so similar of these small little particles, to some of those of your own body. Because your body will still, or your immune system will still recognize if you have a bacterium here, with its like follicles, just to make it clear that this is a bacterium. Your immune system also recognizes this and goes, hold up, there's something wrong. It then kind of learns about this bacterium and it realizes, oh, there's this one very specific antigen. I'll draw it as a triangle that is a part of this bacterium. The problem is when this triangle specific foreign antigen actually looks very similar to one, for example, like this, that's expressed on your own cells, because then your immune system sometimes isn't able to discern between those two again, and will say, oh shit, this is a foreign bacterium invading me, and will start killing your own cells even though they are perfectly healthy and they're not infected. So this is how bacterial invasion and the deterioration of your intestinal health actually can lead to autoimmune diseases. Beside just the autoimmune diseases, it can also lead to chronic inflammation, which is connected to the way that it leads to the bacterial invasion. Because both bacterial invasion as well as the kind of transport of not completely broken down foreign material into your body will activate the immune system. So your immune system, like I said before, recognizes this is from the outside, we need to react to this, and it kind of gets an inflammatory reaction going. It recruits immune cells, it alters the cell or the gene expression of any cells in the vicinity, which can lead to inflammation. Now, in principle, inflammation isn't bad. It is simply your body responding to something foreign, to an invasion, to an outside threat that has entered your body. However, the problem with decreasing intestinal health is that this inflammation will last over extended periods of time. If you are somewhat gluten intolerant and you are constantly eating gluten, you will always have a slow transfer of foreign antigens, of proteins from the outside, of bacteria into your body, constantly alarming your body that something is wrong and something needs fighting. And this chronic inflammation has severe negative effects like immune senescence, where your immune cells will in a way become so overburdened by being constantly activated that they will fall basically into a state of sleep, of inactivity, similar to how you could imagine a human having a burnout, right? If you stress a human for a short period of time, maybe there's a project that they need to get done by the end of the week, they might be able to work for 14 hours a day, 16 hours a day, get 6 hours of sleep, eat a bit, and then right back to work and do that for a week. And that's kind of like your body's immune system responding to an acute infection. But when that persists over a year, over 2 years, over 3 years, that leads to burnout for humans. And the immune system isn't so different, because the immune system wants to avoid overreaction. It wants to avoid the fact that the immune system ends up attacking your own body, and because of that, it kind of has a self-regulating feedback loop. So you have inflammation, which leads to an activation of the immune system, but if that persists, there's kind of a feedback loop to also enable resolution of the inflammation. But if that goes wrong, and you have chronic inflammation because you're constantly allowing new foreign substances into your body, you get chronic inflammation, immune senescence, which of course impacts cancer. And this kind of segues us into the penultimate portion of this video, which is the impact on cancer of a reduced intestinal health. Now, like I already said, I think we'll start with this. Chronic inflammation directly affects the immune system. It leads to immune senescence, and immune senescence itself leads to easier immune evasion by cancers. So this is basically the process by which cancer cells either avoid being detected or avoid being killed by your immune system, because of course cancer cells are a danger to the body, and your immune system, if it were functioning entirely perfectly and if it could recognize the cancer cells as being dangerous and foreign, it would kill the cancer cells. Now, the cancer cells don't want that, so they do their best to avoid detection and execution by the immune system. Of course, if you have an inactive immune system that has kind of fallen asleep by being overloaded by chronic inflammation, then this immune evasion will be much easier. So chronic inflammation is one of the kind of, through some intermediary steps, is one of the drivers and one of the enablers of immune evasion. And by basically promoting immune senescence and thus immune evasion, right? Now, furthermore, chronic inflammation also leads to something called mitochondrial damage. I think if you've watched a couple of videos, you know how important the mitochondria are. But if you haven't watched the other videos, I'll give you a kind of quick rundown of what exactly the mitochondria are, because I don't want to just send you to another video and then, you'd have to come back. But this won't be quite as detailed as those other videos, so I'll put one in the link in the description if you want to know more details. But if you have your cells, you have kind of the nucleus, which I alluded to earlier. This is where all of the... Oh God, what is this? Give me a second. This is where the genes are located. You also have other compartments in your cells, and one of these are the mitochondria. So these are small... These are called organelles. These are basically small subcompartments. So if you visualize the cell as a house, you have the small subcompartments as rooms, and these mitochondria are simply small rooms that exist inside of your cells. Now, these mitochondria have various different functions. One is metabolic, so they are responsible for producing energy for your cell to use. And specifically, the oxidative metabolism happens inside of the mitochondria. But beside that, they are also very important for monitoring cell health. So they monitor cell health. They see, is the genome intact? Is this cell behaving like a proper cell? If this doesn't happen, then the mitochondria can initiate something called apoptosis or cell suicide, to eliminate the cell from your body because it is no longer healthy and functional. However, the problem with cancer cells is that this step, broadly speaking, is inhibited. The mitochondria no longer properly perform quality control of the cancer cells, and they are thus not eliminated. And this is why mitochondrial rehabilitation is such an important step in healing cancer. However, if we look at chronic inflammation, we see that through various processes, such as altering gene regulation, through the constant stimulation of stress genes and a kind of transfer away from the mitochondrial metabolism. If we go back, there's also metabolism that occurs inside of the cell itself and not inside of the mitochondria. Then chronic inflammation shifts this metabolism away towards a metabolism that happens inside of the cell but outside of the mitochondria, which leads to an inactivation of the mitochondria themselves. There are also other specific dietary compounds, for example, lectins, that can directly travel through that can kind of penetrate the intestinal barrier and can lead to the inhibition of certain compounds, certain proteins, certain complexes inside of the mitochondria that are necessary for their function, and thus also lead to mitochondrial damage and mitochondrial dysfunction. Of course, it can also chronic inflammation through leading to heightened mutation, lead to mutations inside of the mitochondria and inside of the cells themselves, which themselves further boosts cancer. And it is kind of through this mechanism, mostly through the mechanism of chronic inflammation and chronic stress signaling inside of your body, that the decrease in intestinal health leads to worsening cancer patient outcomes. So you have a decrease of intestinal health, which leads to a chronic systemic inflammation. So the chronic systemic inflammation simply means that your body in its whole immune system, not just somewhere locally in the gut, but all of the body's immune system is chronically activated over extended periods of time. It's constantly fighting off, which can lead to immune senescence, like we touched on earlier. It can lead to mitochondrial damage. It can lead to reactive oxygen species, which themselves can lead to mitochondrial damage and immune senescence. It can lead to mutations, which themselves again lead to cancer, but can also lead to mitochondrial damage. The reactive oxygen species can also lead to mutations. So there's kind of a whole web of consequences that stem from systemic inflammation that worsen cancer patient outcomes. Now, of course, I think the conclusion from this is pretty self-explanatory. We want to maximize the intestinal health so that this chronic inflammation is as reduced as it can be, that there are no bacteria or no foreign proteins, no foreign antigens invading our bodies. And in order to do this, there are a few things that we can do. The main thing is to eliminate any foods that contain compounds which have the ability to disrupt the gut barrier function. So this would, for example, be lectins or lectin-containing foods, such as legumes. This would be, for example, kidney beans or lentils or something like that. It could be eliminating prolamins. These are, write this out. These are found in cereals, so grains, like I mentioned earlier, like maize, wheat, barley, rye. All of these contain prolamins, which break down and attack the gut barrier function. It could also be elimination of nightshades, because these contain alkaloids that are harmful to the intestinal bacteria as well, the intestinal barrier, and actually also elimination of alcohol, which has also been shown to reduce the intestinal barrier function and thus increase chronic inflammation. Of course, alcohol itself also directly increases chronic inflammation once it enters your body, so there's kind of a double whammy for eliminating alcohol. But the best way we have for promoting intestinal function is by simply stopping our assault on the intestinal barrier, on these tight junctions, by eliminating legumes, cereals, nightshades, and some specific nuts. And by doing this, we can allow our bodies to recover the tight junction, to recover this function of separating the outside environment from the inside of the body. And by restoring this regulation, we can reduce chronic inflammation, we can reduce all the negative effects of cancer that has, and thus we can improve cancer patient outcomes. So this is kind of how intestinal health, how improving intestinal or worsening intestinal health can lead to a reduction in cancer patient outcomes or in their survival and also in their quality of life, because this chronic inflammation that occurs inside of the intestines, or that occurs also inside of the body due to the intestinal barrier breakdown, this chronic inflammation leads to heightened pain in cancer patients, for example, faster cancer growth, less anti-cancer immunity, a whole host of negative effects. So yeah, that's basically all there was for this video. I hope you kind of learned something. Hope you now understand how intestinal health links back to cancer survival, and that you have a couple of pointers on how you can improve your intestinal health by eliminating certain foods from your diets, what changes you might implement. Perhaps there's even already a few that you are doing. But in any case, I hope that this video has helped you in your fight against cancer. Of course, if there's more that you want to read, you can go to marchwood.com. You can go to marchwood.com/mosaic for all of our scientific resources and any of the papers that I read in preparation for this video will of course also be linked down in the description below. So if you're wondering about anything specific that I said in here, whether it's actually valid, you can go down and kind of look at the papers. Or of course also feel free to leave a comment down below if there's any questions, maybe a question about the mitochondria, maybe a question about the inflammation, whatever it be. I'll be happy to answer them. I'm happy to help. And with all that out of the way, I wish you a very good day, and I wish you all the best, lasting health, and swift healing. Goodbye.